So we have our second class now on the ethic of connection and responsibility. One of the two contemporary moral visions whose contest we explore in this course. And I will begin the discussion today. I'm making remarks that are not about Confucius or Confucianism, but about the logic of this moral vision. We have a problem, however, in addressing it. The problem is that it has no canonical formulation other than one that is 2,500 years old. So this presents a special difficulty to try and understand the architecture of this position and to give it not one, but two contemporary formulations. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try and understand its central idea, but then to render it in two different forms, two different contemporary forms responsive to the circumstances and problems of the contemporary societies. The question may arise in your mind, as it has arisen in mine, which of these two contemporary forms is closest to the original teachings of Confucius? I have come to think that this is a question that has no answer, and in fact may have no meaning, because after this radical change in the circumstances, who knows what Confucius himself would have said and thought, and the question is unanswerable and may also be insignificant. So it's in that spirit that I'm going to carry forward this discussion. All we have in the end is one another. This is the central theme of the ethic of connection. Our connections to one another, our responsibility for one another, our care of one another is the central human reality and the ultimate source of value. The great cosmos, the great darkness into which we are plunged, is meaningless, ultimately. But within this meaningless world, we can create meaning. The metaphysical foundations that are most suitable to this view seem to me to be the same of the ones that I proposed as the metaphysical background for the other ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity. That third position in the world history of philosophy, not the philosophy of deep structure which has prevailed in the West, not the philosophy of the timeless one that was predominant in ancient India, but the third position. And I remind you of the general character of the third position. There is one real world, and its most important feature is that it is what it is, rather than something else. Time is real, and everything that exists changes sooner or later. Nothing is less real by virtue of being temporal, because there's nothing that exists, there's no reality that is not temporal. The new is possible, the really new, the emergence of something that never existed before. And our conception of possibility, in fact, is a retrospective interpretation of these novelties, of these breakthroughs in the history of the world. history, human history, has no script. There's no logic of historical succession that determines the outer limits of historical experience. The individual has unfathomable depth, and thus, in addition to being obscure to each other, we are obscure to ourselves. And the ordinary humanity and ordinary experience has more promise than the noble. We must seek light in the shadowy world of the commonplace. These are the metaphysical assumptions of what I described as the third position, which might seem to have the largest claim to our belief, but speaks with the weakest voice in the world history of philosophy. And this is, again, what I propose as the most plausible metaphysical background of the ethic of connection. At the center of this moral vision is the idea of the interpersonal, you and me. The premise is not the isolated self. The premise is our engagement with the others. And the most important question that can be asked of any of us at any time in our lives is, where are the others? The logic of the interpersonal is sacrosanct. It is the ultimate source of authority. We are embodied in distinct and dying organisms, but our minds, our consciousness connects us. And in the realm of consciousness, joint intentionality prevails over separate understanding. Our minds unite us as our bodies divide us. Now, we are not born as social beings. We must be made into them. And we are made into them by the conventions, the rituals, and the roles of society. This structure of institutions and practices, of roles and responsibilities, gives us a second nature. And the second nature becomes, in the end, our real nature. The basic architecture of ethics has to do with our responsibilities to one another. And responsibilities that we have in the first instance by virtue of performing certain roles with respect to one another. But all of this stuff of convention, of practice, of institutions, of roles, and of the responsibilities that result from them is only part of our formation as social beings. There is a second and equally indispensable mechanism that is subjective rather than objective. It is the development of our imaginative empathy, our ability to recognize the otherness of the other, and to see the other for who she is, rather than as a projection of our own concerns. And it is therefore this combination of the institutional, the conventional, the habitual, with the mysterious and indispensable development of our imaginative empathy, our ability to recognize the other, which is our salvation. Our salvation comes from our social nature, and our social nature is the product of the joint work of these two mechanisms. Now, at the beginning in the development of each individual human being, by what we call ontogeny, but also at the beginning in the evolution of the human species, phylogeny. At the beginning, at the first stage, the central moral idea that vindicates the primacy of the interpersonal is the ideal of reciprocity. It is because our relations to one another involve an overwhelming element of reciprocity that they cease to be simply coercive. The evil in our relations to one another is when we treat the other as simply a means to an end. We manipulate him. We view him instrumentally. The affirmation of the sanctity of the interpersonal requires that we be able to overcome this manipulative attitude to the other. And the initial way in which we overcome it, the manifestation of the overcoming, is the affirmation of the ideal of reciprocity. So the children play, but they play under the constraints imposed by the adults. And the human race, before the emergence of states and the development of the world religions, also engages reciprocally within itself, among itself, the human beings. The ideal of reciprocity is summarized in the formula of the golden rule, either negative or positive. Confucius himself proposed it in its negative form: do not do unto others what you do not wish them to do unto yourself, unto you. Christ had given it in its positive form. The problem with the ideal of reciprocity is that it is both indeterminate and incomplete. It is susceptible to radically different interpretations depending on the concrete circumstances of society. And it is incomplete because it doesn't deal with the problem of the context or the constraints that the ideal of reciprocity presupposes. So the ideal of reciprocity is not enough to serve as a guide, as a summary of this doctrine of the sanctity of the interpersonal. In every complex society, it is necessary to confront the way things are. By the way things are, I mean the actual organization of society. And given the actual organization of society, you could then ask, what does reciprocity require in the circumstances of a complex society? And this question has no clear answer. In every complex society, three great moral problems arise with regard to the attempt to affirm the ideal of reciprocity. I'm going to call them the problems of subjugation, of disunion, and of coldness. And in order to develop this vision that places the interpersonal at the center of moral authority, the basis for our salvation, we have to be able to understand how the ideal of reciprocity is to be either developed or superseded by the way in which we respond to these three problems. So first there is the problem of subjugation. In every society there has to be coordination on a large scale. And coordination then provides an opportunity for the assertion of some form of hierarchy. And hierarchy can in turn result in subjugation. And subjugation is one of the ways in which the non-instrumental attitude to other people can be sacrificed to some instrumental approach. So with the emergence of states, there come also classes or castes. Pegging people and their life chances at some place in an entrenched scheme of social division and hierarchy. Now I'm going to distinguish with respect to this problem of subjugation, as well as to the two other problems of disunion and coldness, two different classes of response. The minimalist and the maximalist. They might also be described as relatively conservative and relatively more transformative. And when I said before that I didn't know which of these was, quote, the Confucianist response, what I meant was I didn't know whether the Confucianist response would be the minimalist or the maximalist one. And not only do I not know, but I think that the question itself may be unanswerable. Now, in general, there are two main dimensions on which the minimalist response to each of these three problems differs from the maximalist response. One dimension is that the minimalist response stops much earlier in contesting the established organization of society. The maximalist response goes much further. So always in dealing with these problems, the question is, how much of the received organization of society should we or must we take for granted? Or to what extent do we believe that the reaffirmation of the ideal of reciprocity in the concrete circumstances of society requires a more radical revision of the template of social life? So the maximalist response goes much further than the minimalist response in rejecting the established organization of society and demanding a higher level of transformation. The other dimension in which the minimalist response differs from the maximalist response has to do with the attitude to disharmony, to conflict, to contradiction. The minimalist response may affirm an idea of harmony, harmony in society, harmony in the soul. But the maximalist response requires conflict. And not just social conflict to produce its results, but enduring conflict, conflict within the soul, within the personality. And I think it's the combination of these two differences that defines the fundamental contrast between minimalism and maximalism. So in the circumstances of a contemporary society, one of the societies that exist today, or the societies that have existed for the last few centuries, the minimalist response to inequality or subjugation would, for example, emphasize the combination of compensatory redistribution with meritocracy, the distribution of roles, of positions in society according to demonstrated credentials and capacities. And the premise is we can't fundamentally abolish this inequality and the subjugation in which it results, but we can purge it of its most poisonous aspects through such a combination. So, for example, in compensatory redistribution, we say the market order as it exists, is a tremendous instrument for the creation of wealth. Unfortunately, it generates inequalities. So what do? We profit from the potential of the market to create wealth, but we correct after the fact the inequalities that it generates. We correct it through progressive taxation on the one hand, and through redistributive social spending or entitlements on the other hand. And this is the program of the institutionally conservative social democracy or social liberalism, which has prevailed since the middle of the last century. Its limitation is that corrective redistribution may not be enough to address major inequalities that are rooted in structural characteristics of a society. For example, if there is a hierarchical segmentation of the production system that deepens the chasm between the advanced forms of production and the backward forms. If the vanguards are islands or fringes from which the vast majority of firms and of workers are excluded, and if everyone outside these fringes is consigned to what is in effect some form of make work, then there is a structural problem that compensatory redistribution may be powerless to address. At best, it can attenuate some of the excesses of inequality, but the structural problem would in principle require a structural solution. The tension between corrective redistribution and material progress is captured in the familiar rhetorical apparatus of a contradiction between efficiency and equity. And meritocracy then can collaborate with corrective redistribution as another way of making the reality of inequality or of subjugation seem less objectionable. Now, what then is the maximalist response in such a circumstance to the problem of subjugation? The maximalist response is to reshape the underlying realities, the institutional realities, and to provide a structural solution to the structural problem. So, for example, with respect to this issue that I just evoked, of the hierarchical segmentation of the production system, to say it's not enough to have redistributive correction after the fact, retrospective correction. We have to overcome this abyss that separates the vanguard from the rear guards in the economy, in the world of production. If today the most advanced form of production is what we call the knowledge economy, then we have to replace a knowledge economy for the few by a knowledge economy for the many. And to that end, we may have to innovate in the way that the state deals with private firms so that it can help lift up the vast penumbra, the periphery of the rear guard. And ultimately, we may have to innovate in the regimes of contract and of property in private law in the terms of decentralized and democratized access to the means of production. So, for example, at an extreme, just as a thought experiment, we might imagine a society in which the major means of production are not permanently owned by anyone, and neither are they subject to discretionary allocation by the state. They are vested in independent public trusts. And these trusts lend out the productive resources to whoever demonstrates that they can use them most effectively. So there's a kind of permanent capital auction. And we could say, you might describe this as capitalism without capitalists. There's a market, but there are no capitalists because no one owns anything absolutely or permanently. We couldn't deny that this is a market, but it would be a completely different kind of market. And of course, these structural changes in the nature of economic life would be very unlikely to go forward unless we had also changed the character of political life. and replaced the flawed, weak democracies of today by high-energy democracies that no longer need crisis to make change possible and that overthrow the rule of the living by the dead. So these would be democracies with a high temperature, a high level of organized popular participation in political life, with an accelerated pace. They break impasse rapidly. They fragment power, but when there is an impasse between the political branches of government, they break it quickly through anticipated elections or through comprehensive programmatic plebiscites. And they combine a facility for decisive action by the central government with radical devolution. So as society goes down a certain path, it hedges its bets by allowing parts of itself to deviate from the dominant solutions and to generate counter models of the national future. Those are some of the elements of what I'm calling high energy democracies. So the counterpart to a democratized market is a deepened democracy. And these are all examples of structural change, of the kind of structural change that the maximalist response to the problem of subjugation would require. Now let's consider the second problem. The second problem is the problem of disunion. So in these complex societies, we no longer have what the sociologists like Durkheim or Tönnies called community. Tönnies called it community. Union on the basis of similarity, of sameness. And Durkheim called mechanical solidarity. They're different parts of society, but they're all like one another, juxtaposed to one another. We have differentiation and functional interdependence. The different parts of society become very different. They don't have the same experience. They don't do the same things. And they then are organized by their interdependence rather than by their similarity. So in such a society, which requires difference in order to evolve, what is the ultimate basis of social cohesion? So with respect to the problem of subjugation, the thinkers we think of are thinkers like Marx and Hegel. With respect to the problem of disunion, the thinkers we think of are thinkers like Tönnies and Durkheim. They were unable to find an adequate solution to this issue of cohesion in the circumstances of differentiation and functional interdependence. Functional interdependence is not enough to create cohesion. Now, what is the minimalist response to this problem of disunion? The minimalist response goes back to the basic mechanism of the creation of our second nature. The conventions, institutions, and practices assisted by our imaginative empathy. And we could develop this idea a little more by saying there is an incident in everyone's life which is the characteristic basis for our union. The incident is that when we're very young, we can fantasize that we can be many different things, but then we have to become something in particular to not waste our lives. And when we become something in particular, we have to renounce all those other selves that we might have been. So it's as if we have to cut out our limbs, or some of our limbs, in order to walk, to go forward. So one of the bases of imaginative empathy would be our ability to remind ourselves, to evoke to ourselves those missing limbs, those selves that we did not become. They are our other selves. This is a basis for the unity of the human race, of union in the midst of diversity. So we perform roles, specialized roles, with respect to one another, but we remind ourselves that we and the people that we are interacting with are not just defined by those roles. They are human beings who transcend those roles. Now, furthermore, in this minimalist attitude to the problem of disunion, we have to promote the accumulation of social capital. In all of these societies, people combine in different kinds of association. And these associations are characteristically based on some form of collective difference, religious, ethnic, cultural. So the structure of association cannot be artificial. It has to be, it's something real that exists historically. And we have to begin by inhabiting it. We can't create association, this structure of union, out of nothing, out of thin air. We have to create it out of the materials of history. But somehow the minimalist tells us we have to be able then to use these existing forms of association to care about the others, to assume some form of responsibility for those who are not part of the association. And in this way, we begin to solve the problem of union. We don't despise the existing forms of association, even though they are exclusive and based on difference. But we expand, as it were, their sympathies and their responsibilities. We make them over time more magnanimous. And we create a bridge between the divisions of today and the greater union of tomorrow. That's the essence of the minimalist response to the problem of disunion. The maximalist response is to say, social capital is not just a constant, it's a variable. The fundamental way in which we should deal with the problem of disunion in society is by multiplying the forms of purpose-driven collective action. People who are different get together to undertake some project that they have in common. It is the multiplication of forms of collective action, then, that is the real solution to the problem of disunion. It's not just the forms of association that we've inherited and that we can then use. It's the forms that we can create. We can create new forms of association. And the less dependent those forms of association are on some antecedent form of similarity, the greater will be their promise. Now, this idea, which is the maximalist idea of union, applies all the way at the top to the highest form of association, which is the state, being part of the same people. So, I mentioned in an earlier conversation of ours, the nations of the world used to be, most of them, like tribes, based on some kind of quasi-biological similarity, and then ethnic and cultural sameness. And now they're becoming something else. They're becoming experiments in ways of being human. And along the way, in this passage from the tribes to the experiments, there is a diversion, a detour, an accident that happens. They have to give up part of themselves in order to succeed in the worldwide competition and import practices and institutions from other peoples. So the concrete collective identities are hollowed out. They are eviscerated under the pressure of this worldwide practical and ideological emulation. And then what happens is this, that two nations live side by side, and they come to hate each other, not because they're different, but because they're becoming alike, and they want to be different. Detailed difference, difference with a concrete, customary content, is always porous and subject to compromise and confusion. But abstract difference, the will to be different, can only be the object of an intransigent faith. Now, in relation to this characteristic problem of the poisonous nature of contemporary nationalism, there are two familiar responses. There is the response of liberal cosmopolitanism, which is suppress difference and sacrifice difference to convergence. And there is the response of regressive nationalism, which says reaffirm the earlier difference, the one that was hollowed out. But there's a third response, which is to say, equip difference. Equip the nations of the world with the institutional means in their economic and political means to invent new difference. Difference is not the problem. Difference is the solution. It's only the abstract difference, the will to difference, that is dangerous. Actual difference is much less dangerous. And this change in the attitude to nationalism, therefore, illustrates what I'm calling the maximalist response to the problem of disunion. Now, there's a third problem, which is much less familiar than the other two. The third problem is the problem of coldness. So who were the thinkers that deal with this problem? Much harder to find. We could find some resonances in, for example, the ideas of Max Weber about charisma, or the ideas of Sigmund Freud about cathexis. But let me tell you what I'm calling the problem of coldness. So in many societies of the past, the characteristic formula of personal interactions was the combination in the same social relations of an element of exchange, then an element of power, domination, and finally an element of affect or allegiance. The characteristic formula was the sentimentalization of unequal exchange in the relation between parents and children, between bosses and underlings, between men and women, and so forth. The sentimentalization of unequal exchange radiates out to society something of the warmth of the affect of family life and makes it a formula for all of society. Then come the revolutionary processes of emancipation, democracy, the market, and so forth. A world of strangers. And we become freer, but when we become freer, we also become colder. The formula of the sentimentalization of unequal exchange is suppressed. And a wall goes up between the world of the family, of intimate life, and the life of strangers. So Talleyrand, for example, once said, no one who has not lived before the revolution knows the sweetness of life. The sweetness of life was this world in which exchange, power, and affect or allegiance are all confused. They're mixed together. Now there's this bitter pill of the impersonal. So then the question becomes, this is what I'm calling the problem of coldness. How can we be free without becoming cold? How can we be free and warm at the same time? Now, the minimalist response to this problem is once again based on this creation of the second nature. And in which we are and we feel responsible for the others. We care for the others. And it can have a concrete institutional form. So we have, for example, in the economic order, we affirm social responsibility. And in the past, earlier in the 20th century, there were particular proposals. For example, the corporatist proposal, of the proposal of guild socialism or the proposal of corporatism. the employers and the representatives of the employees should be together in common organizations. And the subjective expression of these efforts will be then the development in society of a generalized benevolence or beneficence. And the form of sociability will be a cheerful, impersonal friendliness, like the Americans attempt to develop in their relations to one another and in their schools. They teach this method of sociability. Now, the cheerful, impersonal friendliness might thought to be a poor cousin to this warmth that I described as resulting from the radiation of family life, the sentimentalization of unequal exchange. But it's certainly better than nothing. And the defender of the minimalism might say, this is the best that we can realistically hope for if we are trying to reconcile emancipation with warmth. Now, the maximalist response to this problem of coldness is quite different. And the essence of the maximalist response is to say, the warmth in collective life cannot come from the love that flourishes in the world of intimacy, in the world of the family, of the lovers. It cannot survive the blast of strangeness, of life among strangers. But there is another source of warmth. And the other source of warmth has to do with vitality and imagination. So let me say a few words about each of these concepts. So, in imagination, the two crucial moves are distancing from the phenomenon and then the subsumption of the phenomenon under a range of possible variations. The adjacent possible, what something can become. To understand something, to imagine it, is to understand what it can become. So we rob it of its brute facticity, but we make it more intelligible. This is what the imagination does. It elides part of the radical contrast between the existent and the non-existent by imagining this penumbra of possible reality that surrounds the existent. And the imagination is connected to vitality. So, what are the attributes of vitality, of life? First, surfeit. Life exceeds structure. There's always more in us, in each of us individually, and in all of us collectively, the human race, than there is or ever can be in the social and conceptual worlds that we build and inhabit. Then there's spontaneity. What is lifelike is what has this capacity for being unpredictable. Like Santayana, an American philosopher, said about another American philosopher, William James. He said, he was so extremely natural that there was no way of knowing what his nature was or what came next. Then surprise. With vitality comes the capacity to give surprise and to surprise ourselves. Vitality and imagination are connected. So what does the maximalist say is the solution to the problem of coldness? It's not this impersonal benevolence, this cheerful impersonal friendliness. It's the creation of institutions and practices that embody in social life these attributes of vitality and imagination. They have the capacity to create alternatives all the time. A knowledge economy for the many, a high energy democracy. That's the source of the energy. It's not love. It's not the incandescent fire of personal love. It's this other fire that comes from the imagination and from the association of the imagination with vitality. Now, there then I have described two different kinds of interpretations of, or solutions to the basic problems that arise of the way things are and the threat that the way things are presents to the ideal of reciprocity. Subjugation, disunion, and coldness. And I've contrasted with respect to each of them a minimalist and a maximalist response. And you can see how the differences are the ones that I stated before. The maximalist response differs from the minimalist one in contesting much more of the template of social life than the minimalist one does, but also in opening itself up to the imperative of disharmony, of conflict, of contradiction, in society and in the soul, in the self. So the maximalist response, the maximalist interpretation of the contemporary version of this ethic of connection and responsibility is much closer to the, what I call the corrected version of the ethic of self-fashioning. Then the uncorrected version of the ethic of self-fashioning is to the minimalist form of the ethic of connection. So they come closer together. They nevertheless do not become the same. Their superficial differences diminish, but in some ways their deeper distinctions remain. Now, before concluding with that very point, let me say a word about the relation of the ethic of connection in its maximalist interpretation to one of the two major functional imperatives of the advanced societies, which I call the development of the higher forms of cooperation. So the contemporary societies have these two functional imperatives. One is the enhancement of personal agency, the creation of the agent who can innovate and disrupt and contest the established context. And the other functional imperative is the development of the superior forms of cooperation. Now, what am I considering to be the superior forms of cooperation? What are some of their characteristics? First, that they untie our possibilities of cooperation from any entrenched scheme of social division and hierarchy. They leave us with our hands free to experiment. They do not limit the forms of cooperation to institutional dogmas or formulas. So they deny, for example, that the market order has a single natural and necessary form. They assert that democratic politics can be radically reinvented, another form of cooperation. The market is a form of cooperation in its traditional form based on the generalization of a low level of trust among strangers. And you could define it as a form of cooperation among strangers that is impossible when there is no trust and unnecessary when there is high trust. In the higher forms of cooperation, our ability to cooperate depends on a heightening of the level of reciprocal trust. In the higher forms of cooperation, the individual is secure in a haven of safeguards against public and private oppression and of capability ensuring endowments so that he can thrive in the midst of the storm of change and conflict around him. And so this combination of the haven and the storm is another characteristic of the higher forms of cooperation. In the higher forms of cooperation, people do not work as if they were machines. The machine does for us everything that we have learned how to repeat so that we can reserve our supreme and, in a sense, our only resource, our time, for the not yet repeatable. And then the combination of the machine with the anti-machine, the human being, becomes much more powerful than either of them alone. And in the higher forms of cooperation, economically dependent wage labor ceases to be the predominant form of free work and gives way to the combination of self-employment and cooperation. For self-employment and cooperation to prevail over wage work, we have to find a solution to the way in which they could be reconciled, they, self-employment and cooperation, with the aggregation of resources at scale. And therefore, we would have to be able to innovate in the property regimes. So all of this is to suggest that what I'm calling the higher forms of cooperation are intimately related with the agenda of what I earlier described as the maximalist version of the ethic of connection. Now at the end, we can ask the question: when, under the aegis of maximalism, the ethic of connection comes closer to the revised form of the ethic of self-fashioning, do they ultimately converge into some kind of synthesis? The subject of our discussion next week. And I want to anticipate my answer to this question. My answer is no, they do not. They remain distinct and in a sense all the more distinct. And in four ways. First, because they have different starting points. The starting point of the ethic of self-fashioning, even in its revised form, is the isolated ego, embodied in this dying organism, the stranger to ourselves, the human body. The starting point of the ethic of connection is never the I. The starting point is you and me. It's the interpersonal. It's the duo. That's the starting point. The absolute primitive in that system. The source of all authority and value. Second, there's a different conception of the self. in the revised ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity, we still have this idea of the radical transcendence of the self. And in the ethic of connection, even under its maximalist form, if there is transcendence, it has a different character. It is naturalistic. We develop collectively, expanding the frontiers of our experience. The ethic of self-fashioning has an intimate relation to what I described earlier in the course as the revolutionary program, the revolutionary project of the last 200 or 300 years. The project which on its political side is associated with democracy, liberalism, and socialism, and on its personalist side with romanticism. The history of the ethic of self-fashioning is inseparable from the history of that project. The ethic of connection is not necessarily opposed to that project, but it's not intimately related to it. It can be selective. It can say, this is good about it, that's bad about it. And finally, there are different moral psychologies inhabiting these two ethics. For the ethic of self-fashioning, the disruptors, the rebels, the troublemakers are the spiritual aristocracy of the human race. The proponent of the ethic of connection suspects that under the pretentious veneer of rebellion, of disruption, there flows the poison of self-aggrandizement. And therefore resist the idea that rebellion, disruption, is this higher activity of humanity. Our highest responsibility is to care for one another. And the question to which each of us must give an answer is, where are the others? Well, I finished.
Wonderful. Let's open this up. And needless to say, many questions now. We will, as Professor Unger's mentioned, be continuing this latter part next week too. So we have plenty of time.
We have plenty of time.
Indeed. Yes, please.
I was wondering about the experimental nature of changing societal structures and strategies. I guess if it has an effect on the market, and the market, like if you change something every year or so, then the market crashes, people suffer. Eventually, like if you experiment too much, there's a chance it'll have consequences, and people suffer and the market crashes every time you have a failed experiment. Then maybe people get tired of it and just go back to something more stable.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, this is a very general question about instability and experimentation. So let me first answer metaphorically and then analytically. So if a tall building is built to swing in the wind, is it more stable or less stable? So you can say it's in some way less stable because it has this elasticity. But it has this elasticity so that it won't break. And so the idea of experimentalism is not the idea of perpetuating decisive conflicts. It's the idea of rendering transformation banal and of bringing it closer to the ordinary tenor of our experience. So now let me answer analytically. We could say there are two classes of moves that we can make in the world. There are the ordinary moves by which we make within a framework of assumptions and arrangements that we take for granted, and that we leave unchallenged, unchanged, and even unseen. And then there are the extraordinary moves by which from time to time we challenge and change pieces of this framework, typically under the provocation of crisis. So what is being proposed by this experimentalism maximalism is that the distance between these two sets of moves narrows, so that the activities by which we challenge and change pieces of the framework, rather than being exceptional or ecstatic or depending on crisis, arise more organically from the ordinary business of life. Uh, and so we could say, this is the hope then, we will then be more powerful and freer. We are freer and more powerful in a world in which we can be insiders and outsiders at the same time. We can engage in that world, but the price of our engagement to it will not be our surrender to it. We can engage and continue revising it and resisting it. That we will be greater then. So that's the answer. That's what I'm calling the analytical answer. So I don't think it's correct to describe that as a circumstance of perpetual flux or chaos or conflict. Uh, it has a different character in which we don't have to take the world at face value. Our attitude to the arrangements is not take it or leave it. We can engage and continue revising. And I think that it's not accurate to describe that as instability. That is less stable in some ways and more stable in others. But certainly it responds to an idea of empowerment. Yes.
Yeah, so apologies in advance if this question is off base, but thank you for today's lecture. It made me think of the beginning of the course where you both discussed how the sort of like school philosophy is really sort of impractical in the sense of the train or wrath hypothetical where it imagines conditions that are nothing like what actually exists, and then we just go round and round in a circle. I guess I'm thinking about how to translate what we talked about today, whichever side of this divide we might eventually fall on, into day-to-day life. And you know, I love thinking about like the obscurity of the soul and life exceeding structure, and all of that seems to me to still operate at a pretty high level of abstraction. Maybe that's necessary just because of the academic context in which we're operating. But in the spirit of this being a class about the conduct of life, I find myself thinking about walking out of the door afterwards, and how do I begin the process of assimilating these sorts of ideas into the way I'm actually interacting with people?
So I think that one of the defects, one of the limitations of my presentation just now is that I presented the program of the ethic of connection, both in its minimalist form and its maximalist form, in a way that emphasized the social and political consequences rather than the moral consequences, the consequences for our behavior. Now, what I actually think is that I've said this before in our arguments, that ethics has to make up for the failures of politics. So these projects, if we describe them in a political form, are not under our control. don't get to choose our place in history, our political circumstance. So one of the roles of an ethical vision, then, is to make up for the failures of politics. And so each of these propositions, my discourse just now, has to be translated into its moral equivalent. So, for example, take that idea of the maximalist response to the problem of coldness, which I said privileges imagination and vitality. What is the moral content of that idea for the individual? I would say the moral content can be phrased, if we were to use the vocabulary of a doctrine of the virtues. We'd say the highest virtues are openness to the other person and openness to the new. And what is being claimed is that this is the equivalent in this vision to the theological virtues in Christianity of faith, hope, and love. And the claim is that there's an intimate relation between our openness to the new and our openness to the other. That in order to respect the others, we have to disrespect the institutions. We have to rob the institutions of their sanctity and to be open to the others. And now, in what set of moral beliefs can this combination of openness to the new and openness to the other be affirmed? And then I would say, these highest virtues, what are these virtues? These are what you would call the virtues of divinization. Because the premise is, how do we become more human? We become more human by becoming more godlike. Godlike with respect to the attribute of transcendence, not to the attributes of omnipotence and omniscience. And for these highest virtues to be at the center of our lives and to exercise their transformative effect on us, not on society, but on us as individuals, they depend on a prior set of virtues, which you could call the virtues of purification, which in the Christian idea, kenosis, it's an emptying out. And what are these higher virtues of these virtues of purification? They are simplicity, the ability to distinguish what's important from what's not. Enthusiasm, the ability to deliver ourselves to experiences that transport us and command completely our emotions. And attentiveness, so we become open to the world and to the lessons of experience, and don't see the world through formulaic lenses. So I would say the individual who's engaged in this project is not, it's not just a political project. It's a project of self-transformation. And if I don't succeed in transforming the world, I nevertheless succeed in transforming myself. And my political defeat can be an instrument in my self-transformation. And so I would develop the discourse further along those lines. And I do think that a certain image of how to live emerges from that. It's not the image that Confucius himself stated, by the way, when he said, right, when I was 15, I set my heart on learning. When I was 30, I took a stand. When I was 40, I had no more illusions. When I was 50, I understood the mandate of heaven. When I was 60, my ear was attuned. And when I was 70, I could follow my heart's desire without overstepping the bounds of life. So this is a dream of the arc of life going from heteronomy to autonomy. The individual becomes then what Kant called the holy will, because what he spontaneously desires is what should be. So that's an example of an idea of harmony, self-possession, integration. As opposed to these ideas, which are the moral content of what I'm calling maximalist, which holds out no such promise of harmony, because it says it's just disruption. And you keep disrupting and disrupting yourself, and then suddenly you die. You're surprised by death. It comes to you while you're trying to live. That's a different vision of human life. Yes.
Yeah, do you think there's any way for the minimalist and the maximalist to see eye to eye? Because they're both like operating under the same rubric of cooperation. They're not saying we're
I
anti-cooperation.
missed the beginning of the question.
Yeah, is there a way for minimalists and maximalists in this regard to see eye to eye or to come together?
In
See eye to eye over what to be done in terms of human cooperation.
I didn't follow that. I missed something in the middle.
That should be brought together, since they're both beginning in the same story.
Well, well, of course, this isn't, they're not like logical propositions that either contradict each other or don't. I think they're quite different, and along the two dimensions that I mentioned, that is and one of the ways in which they're different is they have a different attitude to the way things are. So the maximalist says a great deal more of the way things are has to be put up for grabs and changed. So I would say, summarizing the difference in attitude, it's the minimalist attitude is a humanization of the existing world, a humanization or a spiritualization of the way things are. So its attitude is one of piety. It is pietistic. And the maximalist attitude is piety is no substitute for transformation. And transformation requires conflict. So much more of the way things are has to be put up for grabs. That's one difference. The other difference is the difference that has to do with conflict. So just to tie this in with an earlier set of claims I made in the course, I think that both the corrected form of the ethic of self-mastery and what I'm calling the maximalist version of the ethic of connection are compatible with that vision that I propose of the conflicting presuppositions of self-assertion. Remember I said, to be free, we have to connect, but we have to connect in a way that does not rob us of our freedom. Connection without subjugation. So there's a contradiction in the requirements of self-assertion, because to be free, we have to connect with others, but every connection is a threat. So we have to solve the contradiction between our need for the others and the jeopardy in which they place us. So the second contradiction is, to be free, we have to engage in a particular world. But when we engage it, we can't surrender to it. We have to deny it the last word and keep the last word for ourselves. So there's that second contradiction in our relation to the society or the culture. And then there's a third contradiction in relation to ourselves. To be free, we have to have a coherent self, a character, a modus operandi, a way of being in the world. But we can't let this way of being become a mummy, which will suck the life out of us. So we have to retain the capacity to disrupt it from within. Now, how do we disrupt it? We disrupt it by willing ourselves into circumstances that exact from us a higher degree of vulnerability. We can't disrupt the mummy by an act of will, but we can will ourselves into situations in which we're not in control. And so that's another contradiction. So I would say the maximalism differs from the minimalism in the sense that it accepts this contradictory character of the conditions of selfhood, just as the corrected version of the ethic of self-fashioning does.
So I'm hearing no, you can't really.
I am saying that, yes. I am saying that. And
Okay.
why are you so attracted to the idea of synthesis?
Yeah, I was wondering that, is this maybe just like a desire for unity on my part? I mean, is unity something to strive for? And even thinking within the bounds of cooperation. Like, I think it's ironic that even groups that are anarchic are in some way seeking to reach this ideal of cooperation because they've been failed by the current stance of how things
Well,
work.
and we did mention this idea, right, that which didn't come up today, but it came up before. The unrevised version of the ethic of self-action and the minimalist version of the ethic of connection are strongly associated with these two societies, the United States and China. So when we dealt with the ethic of self-action, I cited a series of characteristics of the United States and the American experience, which I call the dust of history, right? Accumulating around unrevised. So in China, what could you say? Well, of course, there's meritocracy, there's the empire. There's a second characteristic, which you can call familism. You know, when there's no transcendent deity who is the object of devotion, the characteristic object of devotion is the family. In these superficial Christianized societies that we have in the West, the family is often the real object of devotion. But certainly in China, and then there's another characteristic, which is a too primitive or mechanical contrast between order and anarchy. So if there isn't an imposed order, everything will break apart. This has, of course, a whole range of political and moral implications. So it's not an idea that, because experimentalism splits the difference between order and anarchy, right? So these are the, this is the other side of the dust of history. So I would say those characteristics that these two moral visions have, by virtue of their association with these two cultures, in these two countries, are characteristically their weakest characteristics, the ones where they display the greatest frailty. And this also helps account for why each of these two nations is powerfully attracted to the opposite. So there's an element here of contingency. The Chinese would adopt the unrevised version of the ethic of self-fashioning, and the Americans, the minimalist version of the ethic of connection. And that's perfectly plausible. there are resonances in these societies beyond. But they're not attracted to the strongest versions of the other. I'm claiming provocatively that they're attracted to the weakest versions of the other. And so, there's a campaign here, implicit in my discourse, against the unreconstructed version of the ethic of self-action, and against the minimalist version of the ethic of connection. I care much less about whether the ethic of connection in its maximalist form or the ethic of self-fashioning in its revised form triumphs than I care about the defeat and suppression of the unrevised form of the ethic of self-fashioning and the minimalist form of the ethic of connection. Am I splitting hairs too much? No. These are the consequences of a Jesuitical education. Yes.
I had a question about the golden rule in Confucianism.
You,
Wow.
excuse
The
me.
golden rule. Can you hear me? I had a question about the golden rule
The
and
golden rule.
why doesn't it suffer from the same problem as altruism in the sense that it requires us to look at the other and see what we would not want to be done to the other. And in a sense, it requires us to always take as a reference point ourselves, which means that we make ourselves less vulnerable, which also means that there's like some degree of self-projection as opposed to seeing the other for what they are and looking at ourselves as you and I. It seems to be based in the I. And I understand there is an evolution in Confucianism in the sense that through ritual you maybe make this better. But I wonder, how do you get from the golden rule to transcending yourself if your base point is yourself? And maybe I misunderstood some basics of it, but
Well, there's several things to say. So I don't think that altruism and the golden rule are the same thing. The essential spirit of the golden rule is reciprocity. So one way to think about it technically or juridically is it's the equivalent to the idea of good faith in the law. So the good faith is you deal with others in a way that takes their interests into account. Not that subordinates your interests to their interests, as altruism would require. So, to act in good faith is to not profit from the other partner's innocent mistakes or from unexpected circumstances, and in a way which treats the relation as in both your interests. That's the ideal of reciprocity. So, and what inhabits the ideal of reciprocity is a determination not to manipulate the other, not to treat the other as a means to an end. But that's different from the altruistic sacrifice of your interest to the interest of the other. That's altruism. Yes.
I'm also very interested in the golden rule as a very common basis of agreed moral behavior because of the problem that was just raised. That's why people talk about the platinum rule being the better one because it's in the interest of the other person, which requires a leap of imaginative empathy, accurate of imaginative empathy to do it. The question is really whether the Confucian negative construct is actually more accurate than the Christian positive construct.
Of the golden rule.
Of the golden rule, which is to not do what you wouldn't have done to you, the other person, as opposed to do. Those are actually quite different morals, quite different moral direction.
And why is it quite different?
Because what you don't want done to you is quite different from what you do want done. And I can see that there are polarity in those relationships, but a different instruction. It feels to me quite different.
Well, it's more,
Do
some
one,
say
do no harm.
latitudinarian, it creates a larger space. The negative form of the golden rule allows for more possibilities than the positive form. So that's true. But I think both, whether it's positive or negative, there's still the same fundamental problem that the ideal of reciprocity is both indeterminate and incomplete. It doesn't deal with the problem of the way things are. And if I go into one of these societies, these complex societies, equipped only with the golden rule, I don't know what to do, because there are all these problems that aren't answered by what does reciprocity mean in this circumstance or in that circumstance, and what should I do about all these difficulties that I enumerated? So it's only a beginning of a moral vision. It doesn't complete the edifice.
In its extreme, the problem with the golden rule is what does the masochist do with the sadist?
What?
What does the masochist do with the sadist in the golden rule?
Well, the Marquis de Sade, a major moral thinker, I'm being serious about it, said that what the masochist does with the sadist and what the sadist does with the masochist is that they get together and they please each other. The social thinker Fourier devoted an enormous amount of time to figuring out how these opposing perversions might redound to the felicity of the human race. And this was a very serious enterprise. And it's an example, that's an example of a moral thinker who was willing to devote enormous amounts of time to questions that might seem trivial, but that he regarded as relevant to human happiness. For example, how can someone determine whether melons are ripe and therefore sweet? So Fourier devoted a major amount of time to studying this problem. And by altruism, that is, subordinating his interests to the interests of humanity. And this, by the way, is an example of why we might think that altruism, although it seems nice, has unhappy consequences in the formation of personality. So, an altruistic personality is not necessarily one that we can admire. Devoted to questions like this. Yes.
I just want to clarify, so do the two ethics, the maximalist form of the ethic of connection and the revised form of the ethic of self-fashioning, do they have the same economic and political horizon?
Well, it's interesting. I think because this question has come up previously in discussion, not this year, but in other years and other times of paper before. I think you could argue that they have similar convergent political effects, and that they're this is to me not surprising that because our moral ideas can be more fundamentally different than our political ideas. So what this is similar to is Rawls's conception of an overlapping consensus. So supported from these two different grounds. On the basis of different sets of assumptions in political and moral philosophy. But they would nevertheless converge in the same direction. I don't think that robs them of their fundamental distinctions from each other, which are manifest then in the moral idea, the moral vision of how to live. But you are correct that it is compatible with a wide range of political convergence. Have we exhausted the conversation?
Everyone sounds convinced. Any other questions, Glenn or immediate? Again, we will have a full session on this next week, but any preliminary thoughts, concerns, questions? I'm sorry. Any preliminary thoughts, concerns, questions? Oh, yes. Oh, actually, which were, Sasha, was that a raised hand or a point? Oh, yes, please. Sasha, you're too polite. I can never tell if you're raising your hand or pointing to someone. Please.
I just have a quick concern about the idea of warming up the public sphere, because during the 20th century, we've had experiments of warming up for public sphere against, opponents of liberal politics, and none of those experiments have been particularly
On this point, so conservative statecraft and conservative political thinking imagines that politics must be either hot and must be either cold and institutional, or hot and anti-institutional. So Caesarism, a Caesaristic politics, is hot and anti-institutional. So the basic idea is that at the end of the day, with respect to the temperature of politics, that is the level of engagement, of mobilization, there is a choice between Madison and Mussolini. So it's either institutional and cold, or it's hot and extra institutional. I think this is false, because it denies what is in fact the case, that there are arrangements that can be both hot and institutional. They can raise the level of organized popular engagement in political life. And this is of interest because a politics rich in structural content is necessarily a high energy politics, a high temperature politics. So that's what I would say. And sort of the idea of high temperature may seem mysterious, but it turns on very practical, homely arrangements, like the way in which politics is financed. Is political activity financed publicly? Is private financing prohibited? The access of the social movements and the political parties to the means of mass communication, whether they have free access or not. The voting rules, whether, for example, the vote is mandatory or not. And so we can demystify this abstraction, and when we see its practical presupposition, there's nothing out of the world in this. That politics, if, for example, the United States is often described as depoliticized, but give me public finance of political campaigns, free television time, mandatory voting in the United States, and the nature of American political culture would change drastically. Now, so similarly, with respect to the question of the pace of politics, there's a idea, the idea of the Americans is there's a liberal principle of fragmentation of power, and there's the conservative conservative principle, but to resolve impasse quickly. For example, through anticipated elections or through comprehensive programmatic plebiscites. You could have a constitutional arrangement under which if the Congress and the President are stalemated, either of the two political branches could unilaterally call early elections, but the branch that exercises the constitutional prerogative has to pay the political price of running the electoral risk, because the elections are always bilateral for both branches. And then there's the third example of a false opposition, which is about federalism, or about the relation between the center and the periphery. The false idea that either the center has power or the states have power, the periphery. But you can have both. You can have a system in which you say the center has decisive initiative, but under certain constraints, vetted judicially and politically, parts of the country can secede from the dominant solutions and create counter models of the national future, so that you have a dialectic. So this is a series of false oppositions. But to discuss them here would take us far away from the agenda of the course. It's the moral discussion. But the moral discussion is connected to the political. That's the point. I think that what you can say, and this also responds to the question that was asked before, is that political problems seem to be on the whole much easier to solve than moral ones. Then with respect to politics, we can at least imagine transformation. But in the conduct of life, there are a series of alternatives and oppositions that are much more resistant to such reshape.
Wonderful. So next week we will turn head on to a discussion of these two positions, how we debate them out, and what are the implications of the various radically different directions we would go through advocating one or the other, or trying to bring them together in some way. Thank you so much, and see you next week. Thank you.
In terms of like social democrats, I think they think they're doing
What is your guys' take? These are unsynthesizable tenants.
I feel like under a political agenda, by saying that they both right, and he just wants to destroy the unrevised and the minimalist rap, and he doesn't care which one wins. In that sense, like I think the politics are fine, but they just have to different baseline. But I feel like the average person doesn't really investigate baseline policy. They're just caught up in a political system where everybody agrees on the politics, but they're morals. I mean, then I guess the outcome, like that is a synthesis, right? Practical synthesis. Yeah. Yeah, you need some soulful kenosis. That's good.
Oh, yeah.
Pouring out, yeah. Pouring out everything you have. Or that's what I mean. That's kind of what it's that's the moral content of the political discourse.
Do you have to tune in later because it's live in Oslo?
So it's 9.
That's like, who am I to talk?
Yeah, I get
It's
it.
9 a.m. on the set. Oh, it's really
But I think it is really interesting.
Oh, so you get to fly on Thursdays instead of Friday. Oh, I understand. Let me, while you're here, let me look at that Carrasco syllabus, and I'm going to see him. So if you want to come, check it out right now while you're here.
that idea for 40,
Wait, I mean, he's not
60
even-
years.
I love it. This thing's so much fun. It's so good.
He wrote this note in the Harvard Law Review called the First Amendment Cigarette Doctrine.
Yeah.
That was like his analysis of what the Supreme Court was already doing in First Amendment days.
Yeah.
Oh no! Hold on.
Next term, basically adopted by the Supreme Court.
As in,
Wow.
like, your face.
Don't put my
Or
hand in your
face.
face. Wow. Oh, that'll be good.
5 years, you're just sitting back on his laurels.
I know.
One head,
Then to two.
academic.
Well, he was my fourth professor. Such a fucking icon. So amazing.
That's all any of us
It's like the
want,
most
right?
legendary law. It wasn't even an article, it was a student note.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's, yeah, I mean, you know,
I know.